Welcome to our journey through Advent to Christmas and the Epiphany in the way of St. Francis. Victoria and I have created one video for each of the 7 weeks to accompany our daily devotions that are available online. These aren't a video version of the written devotions. Instead, these videos offer additional materials as we reflect with you on the theme for the week and tell of a Franciscan whose life embodied the ideal. Many people today know St. Francis of Assisi as the saint who launched 1 million bird baths, hundreds of thousands of statues, and the service of blessing of the animals. But he was much more than this. The Christian curmudgeon G.K. Chesterton wrote, "The Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried." But even Chesterton thought that there was at least one exception, a Christian actually living the gospel. His name was Giovanni da Pietro di Bernardone. His father called him Francesco. We know him as Francis. He was the son of a wealthy textile merchant, and as such was part of the new Italian middle class that was coming into its own. His father's wealth and Francis' own natural charisma made the young man a leader of the youth of his town. He tried to find glory in battle, only to end up languishing as a prisoner of war and returning home sick. Francis gained rock star-like following by the early 1200s through simply following Jesus. He gained fame and remains famous 800 years later, not because of his own words and actions, so much as because his words and actions conformed so closely to those of Jesus. There is no more characteristic trait taught by Jesus and embodied by Francis of Assisi than humility. The humility of the first Franciscans was seen in their coarse brown robes selected by the son of a wealthy textile merchant who was a bit of a dandy in his youth, sporting the most fashionable fabrics. As we consider humility, Victoria will tell you the story of a saint who followed Jesus in the way of St. Francis, who also set aside fine clothes to dress humbly. A woman born to be queen who spent her short life serving others as though they were each Jesus.
St. Elizabeth of Hungary was engaged at the age of 4, a wife at 14, at 16 a mother, a widow at 20, and a saint at 24. Elizabeth was born to a life of privilege, but came to be adored by those in need as she set aside what was hers by right of birth and marriage to care for the lost and the left out. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Andrew and Queen Gertrude of Hungary. At 4, she was sent to Wartburg, be brought up with her future husband, the 11-year-old Louis, son of Duke Hermann of Thuringia. When she was 6, her mother was assassinated, and her piety grew along with a devotion to St. John the Evangelist and the Blessed Virgin. Growing up with her future husband, Elizabeth and Louis found themselves becoming the best of friends and called each other, "my sweet sister," and "dear brother," until their deaths. When she turned 14, she married Louis, and their love and devotion for each other was legendary. During the next 6 years, Elizabeth gave birth to 4 children, 1 son and 3 daughters, whom she loved most ardently. When not tending to her family or spending time in prayer, Elizabeth could be found using her own allowance ministering to the sick, the poor, and the needy. Only when necessary did she dress to fit her station. Otherwise, she would be found clothed in the simplest of clothes. In 1221, the Franciscans established their first monastery in Eisenach, the capital of Thuringia. It was through these friars that Elizabeth first heard of the Third Order established by Francis. Her husband agreed, and she became the first tertiary in Germany. And while her husband was still alive, she visited an almshouse daily, often bringing food from her own table and even her own plate, to help feed the hungry. Following a famine that occurred while her husband was away in Italy fighting in 1226, Elizabeth ordered that grain be given without reservation to the poor in accordance with their need. She also baked bread and fed about 900 people daily. She also established more almshouses and hospitals, as well as an orphanage. The following year, Louis left for the Crusades, but never made it to Jerusalem. He contracted a fever in Italy and died at the age of 27. Louis's brother, Henry, was appointed as regent for her husband's successor, their 5-year-old son, Hermann. His advisors convinced Henry that Elizabeth was a danger to the financial stability of Thuringia, and shortly thereafter, on a cold midwinter night, she and her children were forced to leave the castle. Elizabeth was chased from place to place, and finally her Aunt Matilda, abbess of the monastery of Kitzingen, heard news of Elizabeth's plight and dispatched carriages to bring her niece and her niece's children to the monastery. Later, Henry sent her off to administer the city of Marburg. She appointed officials to tend to the temporal affairs of the town, and overwhelmed by the adoration of its citizens, she fled to a deserted cabin where she could tend to her needs in relative peace. While in Marburg, on Good Friday, Elizabeth had her hair cut off by the father guardian of the friary and was clothed in the holy habit of Francis and Clare, a gray tunic with white cord. From this day onward until her death, Elizabeth dressed in this habit and walked about barefoot. She spun wool to make money and always prepared her own meals. She had a hospital built at Marburg and spent many hours there caring for the sick. She also cared for the poor in their homes or brought the sick and needy to her own home to be cared for. Many of these were lepers. Shortly after being given a vision of her impending death, Elizabeth contracted an illness, and within 2 weeks she had died, crying eagerly, "The moment has arrived when God summons his friend to the wedding feast. The bridegroom seeks his spouse. Silence, silence." The daughter and wife of kings, Elizabeth set aside what was hers by birth and marriage and used her considerable resources to care for the poor and sick. Her humility confounded the royalty and inspired the poor. In 1235, Elizabeth was canonized in Perugia, Italy, in the same city, and 7 years after her beloved St. Francis.
Francis of Assisi and Elizabeth of Hungary were known for their humility, yet they were both famous in their own lifetimes. Being humble then can't mean holding back and not offering your gifts. Humility also can't mean a lack of self-esteem. As Victoria has written elsewhere, most dictionary definitions seem to accentuate humility as having low self-regard, a sense of unworthiness, while godly humility is an honest assessment of oneself. In humility, you and I acknowledge that, we have some bad qualities we need to work on, some gifts that we're called to honor and express, all while knowing that any one of us is not better or worse than others. As Victoria helpfully reminds me when I get too big for my britches and start to think I might be all that, a fall is not far away. Jesus warned me. I should know better. But it's simply true that if you exalt yourself, you will be humbled, and I know that from experience. I also see how when we have a right view of ourselves as both gifted and flawed, we begin to make room for Christ within us. In the same way that thousands saw Jesus in Francis and Elizabeth, as improbable as it seems, we can have others see the face of Jesus in us. In the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul puts it this way: "For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." That same light of the knowledge of the glory of God is to shine in the lives of all baptized Christians. This happens when our words and action conform to God's will. Both Francis of Assisi and Elizabeth of Hungary served others people in need. And they were transformed more and more to be like Jesus when they were around Francis and Elizabeth. Seeing these two followers of Jesus in this way reminds me less of the coarse brown robe of Franciscans and more like stained glass. With stained glass, the image is revealed only when the light shines through the colored glass. In that same way, the image of the invisible God can shine through our hearts when we show the love of God as found in Christ Jesus. It's the light of Christ shining through us. As imperfect as we are, people can see the face of Christ in our faces, and with spiritual eyes, we can see the face of Christ in them too. And the more we see Jesus in those around us, the more we're drawn to see ourselves rightly, which is the humility to which we are called to as followers of Jesus.
Who have you known or learned of who had the sort of godly humility we are describing in this video? How has serving others in some way changed your own view of yourself?